I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my driveway and saw a cloud of dust rising from the back of my property. My barn, my grandfather's old wooden barn, was gone. In its place, a bulldozer sat idling, and a couple of smug-looking HOA board members stood admiring their destruction. I slammed my truck door and stormed over. "What the hell did you do to my barn?" Clarissa Thompson, the HOA president, turned to me with a satisfied smile like she had just solved world hunger. "Oh, Gregory, you're finally home. We've been meaning to talk to you about this." I clenched my fists. Talk to me, you bulldozed my barn." She waved a manicured hand like I was being dramatic. "It was an eyesore, Gregory. The community voted to repurpose this space for something more refined." I took a deep breath, trying to keep myself from losing it. "And what exactly did you repurpose my barn for?" Her smile widened. "A neighborhood spa, of course. Isn't it wonderful? We're using HOA funds to build a relaxation retreat for the community. We'll have a sauna, a hot tub, massage rooms. It will increase property values significantly." I felt my blood pressure spike. "That was my land, my barn. You had no right." Clarissa gave me a condescending laugh. "Actually, Gregory, you failed to respond to the variance notice we sent out last month. So, by default, the board approved the project. Due process was followed." I narrowed my eyes. "I never got a variance notice." "Well," she said, shrugging, "it's not my fault if you don't check your mailbox." That's when I realized what had happened. The HOA had been trying to get me to sell my land for years. They wanted to turn this neighborhood into some kind of luxury resort, and my old barn didn't fit their aesthetic. But instead of negotiating, they'd pulled a dirty trick, probably sending a fake notice, or conveniently losing my response to justify stealing my land. I took a step closer, my voice low and steady. "You're going to regret this," Clarissa chuckled. "Oh, Gregory, always so dramatic." I turned on my heel and walked away. She had no idea who she was messing with. If they wanted to steal my barn for their fancy little spa, I was going to make sure they'd never enjoy it. And I already had the perfect plan. I spent the next evening sitting at my desk, sifting through every document I had on my property. Old deeds, survey maps, and every single letter the HOA had ever sent me. I wasn't just going to fight them, I was going to bury them under the weight of their own incompetence. First, I needed proof that they had no legal grounds to bulldoze my barn. That meant checking the property lines and zoning laws. I pulled out my grandfather's original deed, comparing it against the HOA's supposed jurisdiction. Within an hour, I had my first smoking gun. The barn wasn't even inside the HOA's official boundaries. It sat on land that had been deeded separately decades ago. That meant they had destroyed private property that wasn't under their control. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. They had overstepped big time. The next morning, I drove straight to the county records office. I wanted to make absolutely sure I had my facts straight before I made my move. The clerk, an older man with thick glasses, took his time pulling the necessary files, but when he finally set them in front of me, I knew I had them cornered. The HOA's jurisdiction ended a solid 15 feet before my barn's foundation. They had no authority over my property, which meant Clarissa and her little band of rule pushers had not only trespassed, but had also destroyed private property without legal permission. I snapped copies of every document I could and left with a plan forming in my mind. First, I filed a formal complaint with the county. That was just the opening shot. Next, I visited a lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia who specialized in property disputes. She took one look at the documents and let out a low whistle. "This is bad for them," she said, tapping the deed with her pen. "Really bad. I want them to pay for every piece of wood they destroyed," I said, "and then some." She nodded. "We can go after them for trespassing, destruction of private property, and financial damages. If they used HOA funds for the project, the homeowners are going to be furious when they find out." That was exactly what I was counting on, but I wasn't just going to let the legal system handle it. No, I had something better in mind. The HOA had stolen my barn to build their ridiculous spa. I was going to take something of theirs in return, something far more disruptive. That evening, after making a few calls, I met up with an old friend, Robert. He owned a farm just outside town and specialized in livestock, particularly pigs. "You need how many?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "As many as you can spare," I said. "Temporarily, just for a little relocation project." Robert chuckled. "You're up to something, aren't you?" I grinned. "Oh, you have no idea." 2 nights later, under the cover of darkness, I pulled up to the HOA's main office with a horse trailer full of Robert's finest pigs. Big, loud, and extremely messy. It took some careful maneuvering, but within an hour, the entire office building was filled with the sound of grunting and the overwhelming stench of livestock. The pigs wasted no time making themselves at home, knocking over furniture, rooting through cabinets, and generally turning the pristine little office into a full-blown pigsty, literally. By the time the sun rose, the HOA office was unrecognizable. I parked my truck down the street and waited. At precisely 8:30, Clarissa arrived, dressed in her usual designer ensemble, and unlocked the door. She barely had time to step inside before letting out a piercing shriek. I watched from a distance as she stumbled back, gagging, her high heels slipping on something that was definitely not mud. HOA board members arrived one by one, each reacting with similar horror as they discovered their office had been transformed into an impromptu pig farm. I strolled up casually, hands in my pockets. "Something wrong?" I asked, barely containing my grin. Clarissa turned, her face red with fury. This is illegal, you can't do this," I shrugged. "Actually, I can. See, I figured since my barn is gone, I needed a new place for my animals. Turns out this office sits on community-owned land, which means any resident can make use of it, and since I'm still technically a resident." I gestured to the pigs, who were happily making themselves comfortable. Clarissa sputtered, her hands shaking. "We'll call the police." I pulled out my phone and held up a document. "Already did, they're on their way, and guess what? They're a lot more interested in hearing about the illegal demolition of private property than a few misplaced animals." As if on cue, a pair of patrol cars rolled up. Officers stepped out, taking in the chaos with barely concealed amusement. One of them, a tall guy named Officer Daniels, approached me first. "Gregory, I assume this is your doing," I nodded. "Just relocating my livestock after my barn was unlawfully destroyed." Clarissa marched up, fury radiating off her. "Arrest him." "He released livestock into a public space." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Public space? I thought this was HOA property." She hesitated. "Well, technically, but then it's not public," he said smoothly. "Which means this is a dispute between members, not a criminal matter." "But destruction of private property," he turned to me. "That, Gregory, is something we do handle." Clarissa's face drained of color as realization set in. Daniels gestured for her to step aside. "Ma'am, we're going to need to have a conversation about your involvement in the demolition of Mr. Gregory's barn." I leaned against my truck, watching as the officers led her away for questioning. The pigs stayed right where they were, happily rooting through what used to be the HOA's pristine office floor. And just like that, the tables had turned. Clarissa's protests grew louder as Officer Daniels led her toward his patrol car, but her words did little to change the situation. The other HOA board members stood frozen, their faces ranging from shock to barely concealed panic. Not one of them rushed to her defense, and I knew why. The moment law enforcement got involved, self-preservation kicked in. No one wanted to go down with her if she was about to take the fall for the illegal demolition. The pigs continued their takeover of the HOA office, knocking over chairs and rooting through piles of paperwork that had been scattered in the chaos. The stench was already unbearable, but I had no intention of cleaning up their mess. After all, the HOA had seen fit to destroy my property without consequence, or so they had thought. Officer Daniels turned back to me after securing Clarissa in the back of his car. We'll be conducting a full investigation into the demolition. If what you're saying checks out, this is going to be a lengthy legal battle for them. I nodded, keeping my satisfaction in check. Appreciate it, officer. I've got all the documents proving my barn was outside their jurisdiction. Daniels exchanged a glance with his partner. I'd get a full property damage estimate as soon as possible. If you can provide solid numbers, the county prosecutor is going to take this very seriously. One of the remaining board members, a wiry man named Gerald, took a cautious step forward. He had been silent up until now, but I could see the wheels in his head turning as he calculated his next move. Gregory, maybe we can resolve this without all the legal trouble. Surely there's some kind of agreement we can reach. I folded my arms, letting the silence stretch between us. Gerald wasn't offering a compromise out of goodwill. He was worried about his own neck. If Clarissa had authorized the demolition, then every board member who had backed her decision was also guilty of approving an illegal act. Officer Daniels didn't look impressed. That's between you and Mr. Gregory, but given the circumstances, I'd say you're past the point of making quiet deals. Gerald's carefully composed expression faltered. This is all just a big misunderstanding. I let out a dry laugh. A misunderstanding? You bulldozed a barn that wasn't even on HOA property. You knowingly misled me about a variance notice that I never received. Now you want to act like this was some kind of accident? He opened his mouth to argue, but I wasn't interested in hearing excuses. I turned my attention back to Daniels. I'll have a contractor come out tomorrow to assess the damage. Once I have those numbers, we'll move forward with legal action. Daniels nodded. Sounds like a plan. In the meantime, I'd recommend keeping records of any further interactions with the HOA. Something tells me they're not going to take this loss gracefully. That was an understatement. As the officers pulled away with Clarissa in tow, the remaining board members scrambled to salvage what little control they had left. Gerald was already on his phone, likely calling an emergency meeting to figure out how to contain the damage, but they had no leverage anymore. The destruction of my barn was on record, and the community was going to find out soon enough. I didn't stick around to watch them flounder. Instead, I made a call to my lawyer, Patricia, updating her on the situation. She was thrilled. This just turned into an open and shut case. If the police are involved, we can push for criminal charges alongside the civil suit. They'll have no choice but to compensate you. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. By the following afternoon, the HOA's office was still in complete disarray. The pigs had been removed, though not before ensuring the place was thoroughly ruined. The cleanup alone was going to cost them thousands. Several residents had gathered outside, watching as maintenance crews attempted to salvage what they could. Word had spread fast, and murmurs of discontent rippled through the crowd. I noticed an older woman, Mrs. Reynolds, shaking her head as she observed the mess. "Serves them right," she muttered. "They've been overstepping their authority for years. Maybe this will finally put them in their place." I wasn't the only one who had been wronged by the HOA. Neighbors began sharing their grievances: outrageous fines, arbitrary rule changes, and selective enforcement meant to push out anyone who didn't fit their vision of a perfect neighborhood. Gerald emerged from the office, sweat beading on his forehead. He had lost the smug confidence he'd displayed the day before. "Everyone, please, let's not jump to conclusions. The situation is under control." A man in the crowd scoffed. "Under control? You destroyed someone's property without permission." Another woman, arms crossed tightly, shook her head. "This isn't the first time you've abused your power. Maybe it's time for new leadership." The murmurs of agreement grew louder, and I could see the panic set in behind Gerald's eyes. That was when Patricia arrived, clipboard in hand. She walked straight up to him and handed over a thick stack of documents. "On behalf of my client, Gregory, I'm serving you with a formal lawsuit for property destruction, financial damages, and trespassing." The crowd gasped as Gerald's hands trembled around the papers. Patricia continued, her voice calm but firm. I'd also advise you to prepare for a full audit of the HOA's financial records. If funds were misappropriated for this unauthorized project, you'll be facing more than just civil penalties. Gerald's face drained of color. He knew exactly what that meant. If HOA funds had been used for the illegal demolition, every homeowner in the neighborhood was going to demand answers. I stepped forward, addressing the gathering residents. It's time we take back control of our community. The HOA has been running unchecked for too long. If they're willing to destroy private property for their own gain, what else have they been hiding? People nodded, voices rising in agreement. Gerald attempted to salvage the situation. We can discuss this at the next meeting, a woman in the front cut him off. No, we're calling for an emergency vote, effective immediately. The crowd erupted in cheers and Gerald knew he had lost. By the end of the week, the HOA board had been completely dismantled. Clarissa was facing criminal charges, and Gerald had resigned in disgrace. A new leadership committee was formed, one that focused on fairness instead of control. As for me, I received a hefty settlement for the destruction of my barn, enough to rebuild it even better than before. And this time, I made sure it was reinforced with security cameras and a legal ironclad boundary that no HOA would ever cross again. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood was finally free from their tyranny. With the HOA board dismantled and the lawsuit in full swing, the neighborhood began shifting in a way I hadn't seen in years. People who had once kept their heads down to avoid fines or retaliation now spoke freely, sharing stories of how they had been pressured, manipulated, or outright scammed by the previous leadership. The new committee had wasted no time in making changes. The first order of business was reviewing every fine, restriction, and project the old board had pushed through. The results were worse than I had expected. Tens of thousands of dollars had been funneled into enhancement projects that never materialized, including a supposed landscaping initiative that had drained the HOA's reserve funds without a single tree being planted. Meanwhile, the remnants of the spa project sat abandoned, a half-leveled lot where my barn had once stood. The crew that had been hired to construct the spa had walked off after realizing the project had no legal permits, and now the HOA was stuck with an unfinished, useless patch of dirt that served as a daily reminder of their failure. I had no intention of letting them move on without consequences. My lawyer, Patricia, had been relentless in pushing the lawsuit forward, and we had reached the discovery phase. That meant getting access to the HOA's financial records, emails, and internal meeting notes. What we found was enough to make my blood boil. Clarissa and her inner circle had been siphoning off HOA funds for years, disguising personal expenses as community improvements. Lavish dinners, first-class flights to conferences, and even a luxury car lease all paid for with homeowner dues. The spa project had only been the latest scheme, designed to funnel money into a contractor company owned by Clarissa's cousin. With this evidence in hand, Patricia filed an additional motion for financial fraud. Now, instead of a civil lawsuit, Clarissa and the others were looking at criminal charges. The fallout was immediate. News spread fast, and it wasn't long before reporters caught wind of the scandal. A local news crew showed up to cover the story, interviewing homeowners who had been affected by the corruption. Footage of the ruined HOA office, courtesy of my pigs, made the evening broadcast, and the entire town got a front-row seat to the HOA's downfall. Clarissa's lawyer tried to negotiate a quiet settlement, but Patricia wasn't having it. She insisted on taking it to trial, ensuring that every detail of their corruption was made public. The prospect of a courtroom showdown must have been too much for Clarissa, because one morning we got word that she had fled town. That didn't stop the legal process. Warrants were issued, and within a week, authorities tracked her down in another state. She was arrested and brought back in cuffs, her mugshot making the rounds in local papers. Gerald, the former board member who had tried to play peacemaker, had turned on the others almost immediately. He provided testimony in exchange for a lighter sentence, detailing exactly how the HOA had manipulated homeowners and misused funds. As for the rest of the board members, they didn't stand a chance. Faced with overwhelming evidence, they had no choice but to plead guilty. Some received hefty fines, while others faced short stints in jail. With the lawsuit wrapping up, I finally got the financial compensation I had been fighting for. It was more than enough to rebuild my barn, and I made sure to hire a crew that would do it right. This time, I reinforced the structure with modern materials while keeping the original charm intact. As I stood in front of the newly rebuilt barn, watching the final touches being added, I felt a sense of satisfaction. Not just because I had won, but because the neighborhood had won. Without the corrupt HOA in control, people started coming together in ways I hadn't seen before. Community meetings were no longer tense affairs filled with threats of fines or restrictions. Instead, they became productive discussions about real improvements, ones that actually benefited the people who lived here. The abandoned spa project was scrapped entirely, and instead of another luxury scheme, the residents voted to turn the land into a community garden and gathering space. The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA had destroyed my barn to build something exclusive and self-serving, but in the end, the space would be used for something that brought people together. One evening, as I locked up the barn for the night, Patricia stopped by with an update. "It's official," she said, handing me a thick envelope. "Full settlement plus an additional payout for punitive damages. The judge wanted to make sure they felt the consequences of their actions." I whistled, flipping through the documents. "That's a hefty price to pay for arrogance," she nodded. "And a warning to any future HOA board members who think they can pull the same tricks." I grinned. "Let's hope they learned their lesson." As she left, I took one last look at the barn, the community beyond it, and the people who had stood up against corruption. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood was finally ours again. With the lawsuit settled and the corrupt board dismantled, life in the neighborhood took a turn for the better. The HOA had been reduced to a mere administrative entity, handling basic maintenance rather than dictating every aspect of people's lives. The new leadership committee, made up of actual residents who cared about the community, ensured that decisions were made transparently. But just because the dust had settled didn't mean everyone had learned their lesson. There were still remnants of the old HOA crowd, people who had benefited from Clarissa's rule, who weren't happy about the shift in power. One afternoon, as I was finishing up some repairs on my newly rebuilt barn, I noticed Gerald lingering near the property line. He wasn't wearing his usual smug expression, but something about his presence put me on edge. He had slithered out of the worst consequences by throwing Clarissa under the bus, but that didn't mean he was off the hook in my book. I wiped the sweat off my brow and walked toward him, keeping my tone neutral. "If you're here to admire the barn, go ahead and take a good look. It's not going anywhere this time." Gerald shifted on his feet, looking more uncomfortable than usual. "I didn't come to cause trouble, Gregory." "Then why are you here?" He hesitated, then glanced around as if making sure no one else was listening. "There are still people in the neighborhood who think this whole thing was blown out of proportion. They're not happy with how things turned out." I crossed my arms, waiting for him to get to the point. "They're talking about bringing in a management company," he continued, "a third party to take over HOA operations. No more resident-led committee." I let out a low breath, already feeling the headache forming. "Let me guess. Some outside company with no connection to the community, just looking to squeeze every last dime out of homeowners." Gerald gave a small nod. "That's usually how it works. Lots of fees, lots of rules, and no accountability. The argument is that it'll bring professionalism back to the HOA." I narrowed my eyes. "And why are you telling me this?" "Because I know what happens when power gets handed over to the wrong people." he admitted. I saw it with Clarissa, and I went along with it. I don't want to see this neighborhood turn into a corporate-run nightmare. I studied him for a moment, trying to decide if this was some kind of trick. Gerald had never been a leader. He had always followed whoever had the most power. But if he was coming to me now, it meant one thing: he was afraid of losing control entirely. If they bring in an outside company, the residents lose their voice, I said. Decisions get made by people who don't live here, who don't care about anything but profit. Gerald nodded. Exactly. And if they get their way, we'll all be paying for it. A slow anger started building in my chest. After everything that had happened, after exposing the fraud and corruption, there were still people who wanted to hand over control to another group of rule enforcers. I wasn't about to let that happen. I spent the next few days reaching out to neighbors, warning them about the push for a management company. Most of them were completely unaware that the discussion was even happening. It had been kept quiet, no doubt to prevent backlash before it was too late to stop. At the next community meeting, the tension in the room was thick. The new leadership committee had barely settled into their roles, and now they were being pressured to hand over control to an outside entity. A man named Richard, one of the remaining supporters of the old board, stood in front of the group, pushing his agenda with the same arrogance that had defined the previous regime. We need professionals handling the HOA, he declared. Volunteers can't manage a community of this size. A management company will ensure things run smoothly without all the unnecessary drama. I stood up before he could keep spewing nonsense. You mean without any input from the people who actually live here? Richard scoffed. Homeowners will still have a say. No, they won't, I countered. Once you bring in a management company, they make the rules. They decide fines, fees, and enforcement, and guess what? They don't answer to us, they answer to their bottom line. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were listening, and Richard knew it. The previous board made mistakes, he said, trying to regain control, but that doesn't mean we should throw out structure entirely. This isn't about structure, I shot back. This is about control. The old board abused their power, and now you want to hand that power over to an outside company that doesn't even live here. Do you think they'll care about our community? Or will they just care about how many fees they can charge? A woman near the front raised her hand. What kind of fees are we talking about? I turned to her. Management companies charge for everything. Want to paint your house? Fee. Need approval for a new mailbox? Fee. Violate a rule you didn't even know existed? Big fee. Another homeowner chimed in. I used to live in a neighborhood with a management company. They charged us for every little thing. We had no say in anything, and they raised dues every year. That was all it took to shift the tide completely. People started speaking up, sharing their own concerns and experiences. Richard tried to regain control, but it was too late. The community had made up its mind. When the vote was called, the decision was nearly unanimous. No management company. The HOA would remain in the hands of actual residents. Richard stormed out, realizing he had lost. As the meeting wrapped up, people came up to me, thanking me for speaking up. Gerald, of all people, lingered near the back, watching everything unfold. He caught my eye as I walked past. You were right about Clarissa, and you were right about this. I gave him a nod. Let's just hope people remember this lesson before they let power slip away again. As I walked home, the weight of the past few months slowly lifted. The barn was rebuilt, the lawsuit was settled, and the corrupt board was gone. But more importantly, the neighborhood had finally woken up. They had seen what unchecked power could do, and they weren't going to let it happen again. For the first time in a long time, it felt like home. The morning air was crisp as I stepped outside, taking in the view of my newly rebuilt barn. The structure stood tall, stronger than before, a symbol of everything the HOA had tried and failed to take from me. The lawsuit had been settled, the corrupt board had been dismantled, and the neighborhood had taken back control. But just because the biggest battles were over didn't mean everything had returned to normal. There were still remnants of the old regime lurking in the shadows, people like Richard, who had tried to bring in a management company to tighten the HOA's grip again. Though we had shut down that attempt, I knew better than to assume they would give up so easily. Power-hungry opportunists never did. As I walked toward the barn, I spotted my neighbor, Evelyn, making her way up the driveway. She had been one of the most vocal residents pushing for change, and over the past few weeks, she had become a key figure in ensuring the new leadership committee stayed on the right path. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "You're going to want to hear this." I gestured toward the barn. "I was hoping for good news." She shook her head, handing me a folder. "Richard and his little group have been meeting in secret, trying to find another way to take control. Someone leaked this to me last night." I opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. What I saw made my jaw tighten. Richard and a handful of former HOA loyalists had been working behind the scenes to propose a new amendment to the bylaws, one that would give them the authority to reinstate the previous board structure under the guise of restoring order. If passed, it would grant them the power to override the current leadership committee and put their own people back in charge. I flipped through the pages. It was a blatant power grab, hidden beneath carefully worded legal jargon meant to confuse homeowners into thinking it was a necessary measure. Evelyn watched me carefully. "They're planning to push it through at the next meeting. If they get enough votes, it's back to the way things were." I exhaled slowly, keeping my anger in check. "They really don't know when to quit, do they? They're banking on people being complacent now that things have calmed down." Her voice was firm. "If we don't get ahead of this, they might actually succeed." I wasn't about to let that happen. Over the next few days, I worked with Evelyn and a few other trusted neighbors to spread the word. We went door to door, explaining exactly what Richard and his group were trying to do. Most people were furious once they realized what was at stake. They had fought too hard to take back control of the neighborhood to let a handful of schemers undo it all. By the time the community meeting rolled around, attendance was at an all-time high. The meeting hall was packed, homeowners filling every available seat, some even standing along the walls. Richard and his group had clearly been expecting a much smaller, more controllable turnout. I saw the discomfort flicker across his face as he stepped up to address the room. He launched into a well-rehearsed speech about stability and restoring proper governance, trying to paint the new leadership committee as inexperienced and incapable. He spoke about protecting property values and ensuring the community remains a desirable place to live. It was the same manipulative rhetoric the old HOA had always used to justify their overreach. When he finally finished, I stood up. The room quieted as I made my way to the front. "You talk a lot about stability," I said, my voice carrying through the hall. "But what you're really talking about is taking power away from the people who live here." Richard forced a practiced smile. "That's not what this amendment is about." I held up a copy of the document, flipping to a highlighted section. "This clause right here gives the board the ability to override community votes if they deem it necessary for the well-being of the neighborhood. That means if this passes, you can dismiss any decision the residents make." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were starting to catch on. I continued, flipping to another section. "And here it states that board members will have the authority to impose emergency fees without prior approval. That means you can start charging homeowners whatever you want, whenever you want." Richard's smile faltered. "These are standard measures to ensure." "Standard." I cut him off. "You mean the same standard measures that let the previous board bulldoze my barn without permission. The same standard measures that let them misuse thousands of dollars in HOA funds." The tension in the room thickened. Richard's supporters were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, realizing they were losing control of the narrative. A man in the back stood up. "So you're saying if we approve this, we're basically giving them the power to do whatever they want again?" I nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying." Evelyn stood as well, addressing the crowd. "We fought too hard to take back control just to hand it over to the same people who abused it before. If we let this pass, It won't be long before we're right back where we started facing ridiculous fines, arbitrary rules, and leaders who only care about lining their own pockets. The murmurs turned into full-blown objections. People were angry, and rightfully so. Richard tried to regain his footing. "This is being blown out of proportion. We're only trying to do what's best for the community." A woman in the front row scoffed, "By tricking us into signing away our rights." At that moment, it was clear the amendment was dead in the water. No one was buying Richard's excuses. The vote was called and the results were overwhelming. The amendment was rejected and the crowd erupted into cheers. Richard and his supporters sat stiffly, realizing they had lost. As the meeting wrapped up, people approached me, thanking me for calling out the scheme before it could take hold. Evelyn grinned, shaking her head. They really thought they could pull this off. They underestimated us. I glanced toward Richard, who was slinking toward the exit. And I don't think they'll be trying this again anytime soon. With the last threat to the neighborhood's freedom shut down, I finally felt like we had won for good. The HOA was no longer a tool for control, it was just a small, functional part of the community, as it should have been all along. As I walked home that night, I looked back at my barn, standing tall under the moonlight. It was more than just a rebuilt structure. It was proof that no amount of corruption, no level of greed, could take away what truly belonged to us. The neighborhood was finally ours again, and this time, it was going to stay that way.